gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes, sir. Then again I'm falling. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes, sir. Then again I'm falling. Let Jesus work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Oh, work it out. You work it out for Mother Teresa. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes, sir. Then again I'm falling. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes, sir. Then again I'm falling. Let Jesus work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Oh, work it out. You work it out for Mother Teresa.
Oh. All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos. And today we have actually a surprisingly very interesting stream, sponsored stream. Major shout out to Jason today regarding Puritanism. Puritanism is kind of a topic. Usually it seems a little boring. It's, you know, I struggled trying to find some video content for today's stream, but I got to say, actually diving into this, I am no expert on Puritanism or some of the religious sentiments and their influence on America per se. So this research, this deep dive was actually very interesting to me. More so, and I mentioned this to Jason, more so than I was even expecting to begin with. So shout out to, again, Jason for sponsoring today's stream. And we're going to give he's got his own historical podcast. We're going to give him a shout out here in just a few. I'm going to have it pulled up here when we start looking at some of the videos and some of the links, and I'll share that with you guys. But we're going to be looking at the Puritan influence, what I'm arguing, on the soul of America. Now, this is actually a debated topic amongst historians, is how much influence did Puritanism have in shaping the sort of American ethos? And it is a debated topic. Obviously, Puritans, the name comes from their advocacy for further reform. And so they emerge essentially during the English Reformation. So we're talking about the 1530s and such, where King Henry creates essentially the Church of England so that he could divorce his wives. But Puritanism, emerging out of this cultural milieu, it was very much interested in purifying the Church of England from what it considered the detritus of Catholicism. And so Puritanism never intended to be its own religion per se, or it's a Protestant sect divorced from the Church of England. Their goal was essentially reforming the church from within. And this is going to cause major problems. Anybody who's familiar with the English Civil War and the fight against the royalists and the parliamentarians, you're going to be familiar how Puritanism and this religious theological impulse, and I'm going to give you guys a historical context here, because actually, shaping the historical context, I think, makes the subject a lot more interesting, because Puritans, as a just generic specific group of study, I personally don't think it's the most interesting topic in the world, but their influence, as I'm going to try to make the case today, is actually considerably profound. And I have 4 areas where I'm going to make the argument that Puritans have shaped the general soul of America. And I'm going to make those arguments in just a second, but the first one is democracy versus monarchy. And again, that's going to connect with what I'm about to say, kind of setting the historical context of Puritans in the English Civil War and all this stuff. But their reluctance and their admonishment of monarchy and hierarchy. The second one is a revolutionary spirit, is that because of the intensity of their reforms, it never stops. Puritanism is, I would argue, I know I've seen some people online in preparation for the stream, not everybody would make this case, but I would argue that Puritanism are the skeletal bones of contemporary evangelical Christianity. I'm going to make that case. And then number 4, I'm actually going to make the case that the radical modern left, or the progressive cancel culture ethos, that this is actually rooted, again, in a sort of Puritan spirit. So the goal is to connect this historical phenomenon that really by the Second Great Awakening, so before the Civil War in America, Puritanism is essentially massively on the decline. Now, its influence has already been felt, and it was a great catalyst for some of the Baptists and the Methodists during that period. But when we're talking about Puritanism today, really what we're talking about are these groups of people in England that really emerged after the 1530s. And I would say the height of their influence, it's all before the American Revolution. And so the most iconic American Puritan theological thinker is obviously Jonathan Edwards. And so him being an extreme catalyst for the First Great Awakening, I would argue that was kind of the climax of Puritanism in America. And really after that, it begins to wane because of the growth of secular rationalism, especially during the founding of the United States. I mean, really, the kind of 20-year period that includes the founding of the nation, I would say from, let's do 1765 to 1785. This is really kind of the beginning ethos of what we would consider the American Revolution and then the founding of the country. And after the Revolution, certainly Puritans exist. Certainly their influence is felt in New England, and their influence is going to be felt, including the abolitionist movement, the temperance movement, trying to do away with alcohol in the United States, or the usage of alcohol, and then feminism. I'm going to explain how all these things connect. So it's not an expansive history. It's not like we're talking about even the Church of England, where there's a much longer historical lineage here. Puritanism is kind of short-lived in its purest form, right? For Puritans, they're interested in purity. So the purest form of Puritanism is really kind of a small window. I would say really about 300 years. I mean, and really its great influence is probably less than that. So, okay, now with all that being said, and we're going to come back to its relevance in the contemporary period. But first, I want to set the historical context of what's going on when we're talking about these pilgrims coming to America and setting up shop in Plymouth, right, and New England area, and essentially creating the image of what we now understand as the Puritans. So imagine, and I've talked about this before. Okay, so Protestant Reformation 1517, and one of the things that is occurring after that period moving forward is that Protestants kind of have a religious liberty in places like Switzerland and Germany, more so compared to England once we start getting into the 17th century. And so I've talked to you guys about the 16th century, the 1500s, and I think this, it's probably biases because part of my specialty in the field of religious studies is looking at Western esotericism, the history of Western magic and these sort of esoteric spiritual ideals. And I have always talked to you guys about the 16th century being the most magical century in European history. And this is where we get a figure like John Dee, the great alchemist, the great magician, and his legendary tales with Edward Kelly. And so if you guys aren't familiar, so this is during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. And she was much more of a moderate regarding this tension that emerges after the 1530s between the Puritans, if we will, that want further and further reform in England. They see the Church of England and they hate vestments. They don't like the crucifix with Christ on it. And there's the Book of Common Prayer. There's a handful of really external factors within the church that the Puritans want to purify from. They want to do away with these things. They view them as too much Catholic influence, and they feel like the Reformation project has not yet been completed. It needs to continue to go further. Somebody like Bloody Mary, Queen Mary I of England, she is very much on the pro-Catholic side of this debate, and so she ends up marrying like a Spanish prince, and then she basically reinstates the dominance of Catholicism back in England and forces some of these Puritans to leave England, and they flee into places like Germany and France. Well, upon coming back with the reign of Elizabeth I, they are now in a cultural context where they're accommodated in the sense that they're allowed to speak out against what they believe to be the sort of drags of Catholicism left within the Church of England. But as long as they didn't rock the boat too much. But during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, this is where we get a figure like John Dee. And why am I talking about the magic stuff? Because I'm trying to set the stage. If you were a Puritan in the 17th century, what is the world that you're looking at? What is the world that you're experiencing? Well, during the 1600s, the 1500s, we have, again, John Dee, Edward Kelly. They create the Enochian language. According to John Dee, the shoe stone, this black obsidian stone, falls from the sky, which he claims to be a gift from God, that allows him, upon meeting a man that had no ears, which signified that he was already deemed to be a thief or a con artist, so that wherever they went, your ears were cut off. Everybody would know that you were found to be guilty of theft or conning people for one enterprise or another. Anyways, Edward Kelly, this con artist, links up with John Dee, who at that time is the court magician, the court astrologer, arguably the most learned man in England. You could debate maybe other people, but very, very influential. And he is really becomes the archetype of the 007, the James Bond, because he would travel around to various royal courts in Europe, and he would spy for Queen Elizabeth. And Queen Elizabeth allowed him, and she accommodated his sort of magical enterprise. And so the story with John Dee and Edward Kelly is that they do these conjurations, they do these ritual invocations, and they claim that they're contacting these angels and they're deciphering these messages and writing them all this out. And this eventually makes its way over to the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Rudolph II, who was a very strange type king. I mean, he was kind of an overweight man, signifying his wealth at the time, very much interested in magic and alchemy, kind of allowed Bohemia to be a groundswell for people interested in these enterprises. You get people like Michael Meyer and the other alchemists during the time. So he actually gives an invitation for John Dee and Edward Kelly to come over, and their goal was he was going to pay them not only to conjure these entities, what they called angels, we would probably see them as demons, but to actually transmutate lead into gold, to complete the alchemical project. But for Rudolph, he wanted it very literal. Obviously, you ask a contemporary alchemist, they say, well, this is all spiritual metaphor for the purification of my soul. And that was true, but it was also believed that you could distill lead into actual physical gold. Well, turns out that enterprise didn't work. Edward Kelly, the con man, their conjurations aren't working. He convinces John Dee, hey, I need to sleep with your wife, who, again, John Dee's very well educated, very high status, has a much younger, beautiful wife, and basically forces her to sleep with the con man Edward Kelly. And then John Dee sleeps with Edward Kelly's wife. Again, funny how all this magic stuff always ends in sex. Sleeps with Edward Kelly's wife, then they go to do the magic ritual again. It's still not working. John Dee claims this is one of the worst things that ever happened in his life. Anyways, fast forward, he eventually goes back to England. Edward Kelly is locked by Rudolph II to stay at his court, and he is commissioned to continue this transmutation of lead into gold, of which he realizes he's not going to be able to do. He tries to sneak out and escape one night, slips off one of the Spanish tiles on the roof, and falls to his death. So that kind of encapsulates that little period. Now, why am I saying all this? Because it is in this cultural milieu where we get the Rosicrucians, where we get the Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt, and that the spirit for esoteric spirituality was very, very deep after this Protestant Reformation, because they thought they could incorporate Hermeticism or even Kabbalah, Christian Kabbalah, Giovanni Piccadella Mirandola, into a new form of Protestant Christian theology that wasn't tied with the Catholic Church, their arch rival in many ways. So after Elizabeth, and John Dee goes back, and he, unfortunately for him, dies in disgrace and poverty. His wife never forgives him for forcing her to sleep with Edward Kelly. But the next person that comes in power in England is James I, King James I, formerly James VI of Scotland, and unites Scotland and England. This is the King James that gives us the King James Bible. Well, why we get the King James Bible? Because of his accommodation to the Puritans in England. Because one of the things that we'll see, and one of the reasons why even public education in America is rooted within Puritanism, is because of their immense focus on education and literacy. And this is also going to tie into their influence on the beginning of first wave feminism, is because Puritan women tended to be very literate, because they were expected to read scripture daily. They were expected to understand things. They were expected to memorize things. And so because of this formal education that women got in their community, literacy and their role within the community was, you could say, a little bit elevated compared to other sects, if you will. Anyways, so James I comes to power in England, and he very much doesn't want to rock the boat, and is much more of a sort of moderate regarding this tension within England between the maintaining the sort of vestment and the liturgical sort of ancient feel and aesthetic of the Church of England versus the Puritans who want to purify. And the Puritans held societal influence because they were the parliamentarians. Many people in Parliament were of wealthy status, and they were Puritans. And this is where you get the English Civil War and this battle between what eventually comes from the son of James I, Charles I, and the parliamentarians. This is where James I shuts down Parliament, and the parliamentarians eventually behead Charles I. And so it's in this cultural milieu that the Puritans actually begin to leave England and come to America. Now, the general commentary is that the Puritans came to America to flee persecution. And that's not entirely true. The first settlement, Jamestown, I mean, obviously Roanoke is under Elizabeth I. And of course, that's a mystery to history. We don't even know what happened to those settlers. Were they killed? Was it disease? What exactly happened? The ships came later that year and nobody was there in Roanoke. So the second settlement in Jamestown refers to this settlement being issued by King James. And so unlike the general narrative where we think that these Puritans were fleeing like the threat of death for their religious beliefs, not so much. Actually, Britain was funding their trips. Now, did the king, be it Queen Elizabeth or King James or Charles I, or then later Charles II after the English Civil War? Charles I, of course, is beheaded. Did Charles I persecute the Puritans? Yes, he did. Yes, he did. But my point and the caveat here is that the migration to the United States had already occurred. And the 20 to 30,000 Puritans that come after the founding of Plymouth in 1630, that was during the height of Charles I, the son of James I. And Charles I, he believed in the absolute rule of the king. And so my first point here that I really want to highlight is when we're talking about Puritans and we're talking about their trip to America, we have to realize that they are bringing a new world mentality. And this has to do with their democracy and their animosity towards monarchy. And so because of the reform of the Reformation, they are constantly wanting to reform and reform and reform. And it moves from the external factors of the Church of England eventually to, as we'll see theologically, to the internal state and these conversion experiences. But then when they get to America, creating the sort of millenarian utopian kingdom. These were post-millennialist. So the Puritans believed, and as I didn't even get into the theology, these are Calvinists. So they all believe in predestination. They believe in the five tulips, the five sort of principles of Calvinism. And they believed that they were predestined to go to America and essentially create the millennial kingdom that was going to bring Christ back after 1,000 years of this millennial kingdom that they're going to create. So, yes, they were being persecuted under Charles I, who again is later beheaded during the English Civil War. But it's a little bit exaggerated to say that the first, like the pilgrims that came to America came because of they were under threat of it. No, the British monarch, I mean, they paid for them to come here. They gave them the ships, the Mayflower. The general thinking, the way that I read it, doing the research is that the British were like, look, you guys are causing a lot of ruckus here. And the general disposition of the throne, be it a queen or a king, is to kind of like, not make too many reforms. Like we're already kind of done reforming the Church of England. Although eventually they make accommodations, which has been a continual pattern of the Anglican Church. Now, don't they want to say that God's no longer, they don't want to use male pronouns? So, anywho. So I want to go back with the Puritans, and one of the reasons why they're fleeing America is Frederick the Elector Palatine. Under James I, he had a daughter, Mary Stuart. Again, his King James of the Stuart dynasty. She marries Frederick the Elector Palatine, who he believed himself to be the Rosicrucian king, Protestant king, expected to create a new kingdom in Germany, essentially converting what was the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburg power into what they believed, these Rosicrucian movements, the Illuminati movement, all these Hermeticists, all these alchemists who were Protestant. They believed that Frederick the Elector was the one promised in the Rosicrucian manifestos. And he was very much interested in this magic stuff. James I actually wasn't. James I hated John Dee because of all the magic he did, and did everything he could to further tarnish John Dee's name. And even though his son-in-law, Frederick the Elector Palatine, was very much into this stuff, he did have a close relationship with King James. Now, King James does not come to his aid or his defense because it's Frederick the Elector Palatine who, again, supposed to be the new king of Bohemia, creating this Protestant Hermetic kingdom, fulfilling the wishes of Christian Rosenkreuz, right? This mythical figure that's the founding of Rosicrucianism, which is really a perennial understanding of like a sort of generic Christianity surrounded by a perennial spirituality, really rooted within esoteric spirituality. And he loses at the Battle of White Mountain. This is the beginning of the 30 Years' War. So this is what, 1620s? And so this is right at this point, we're already getting Puritans and British colonizers coming to America. So this is the cultural milieu that they're operating in. And of course, that fails. The 30 Years' War ends in an unexpected way for these Hermetic Protestants. And the Puritans see all this stuff and they want further reform. They don't want any of this magic stuff and they don't want any of this Catholic stuff. And so this really sets the basis, then the cultural basis for how they come to America and create the New England as a Puritan hub. And so we're going to break it down, all that different history, but that's kind of the cultural historical context where all this stuff is coming from. And it isn't until 1776 that we get the founding of the United States. So you could argue, I mean, so from 1630, which is the second shipment, right? It's not the Mayflower and the Pilgrims of Plymouth. That comes earlier. It's the second shipment of people under Charles I, where we get 20 to 30,000 more Puritans come to the New England area. Now they have a thriving community of people. And one of the things that the Puritans did is they were very well educated. And we're going to see this even talking about Jonathan Edwards. I mean, Jonathan Edwards, and he really is emblematic of a man between two periods, because this period between the 1600s and until the American Revolution, in my mind, is really the entrance into full modernity, full modernism, with the scientific rationalism, democracy, progressive ideology, all these things that I've talked about, these pillars of what the modern mindset is. And so because Jonathan Edwards exists really at the beginning of the 1700s, he exists in between two worlds. And the Puritans are bringing this new world mentality where they're no longer interested in the divine right of kings, right? Back in the old world, back in Europe, before they came to America, it was just commonly accepted, even still in the 17th century, the 1600s, that the king was divinely appointed by God, and that Christians, even Protestants under King Henry, Catholics, Orthodox, believe that the king or the emperor was divinely appointed, and that whether how immoral or moral they were, this was reflective of the piety and the sanctity of the people, so that their judgment is based on the people who rule them. This is a biblical understanding. The Puritans were not interested in this anymore. And this has to do with the rereading of Romans, right? When Paul tells you essentially not to try to overthrow the government, that this is God's providence. The Puritans had to struggle with this because, especially during the English Civil War, they're interested in reform, constant reform. Let's change things. We got to purify things, because for them, theologically, civil society and their moral theology are intricately tied, and that this is why they believed America was going to be the shining city on a hill, right? Because it was going to be a place where these Puritans, for these reformers, these Calvinists, these predestined elect, right? So imagine this, these Puritans, and this is where you got to give them credit. I mean, they're literally going across the Atlantic to an unknown world with their wives and their children to, in their minds, they are divinely elected by God. They are what they would believe as the visible saints. So they don't believe in saints the same way that we Orthodox do. They believe the practicing reformers are the visible saints, that they are predestined to come to America and create the millennial kingdom. Now, this, I would argue, is a central feature and Puritan residue within America today. So let me lay out now some of what I consider the four biggest influences that Puritanism has had in America and continues to exert to today. That's enough on the sort of historical context, and we're going to come back to the historical context. I got a video that's going to give you pictures and things to express the things that I was just talking about. But the number one thing that I would say is one of the greatest influences of Puritanism on the American soul, and I don't mean my soul, although it certainly affects us in our disposition, it affects our paradigm and our worldview. I would say the American soul as a nation, number one, is the privileging of democracy over monarchy. This is the basis of the English Civil War that these people are fleeing from, is that they are ready to do away with this king. They view the king as tyrannical. They're against hierarchy, right? So the Puritans don't have bishops in the same way. This was another rift that was occurring in the Church of England, because the Puritans who are in the Church of England are criticizing the Church of England for its hierarchical structure. And so the Puritans saw democracy then as a covenant with God. In a sense, because of their anti-hierarchical thoughts, they replaced the body of Christ, meaning the Orthodox Church for us. We are the body of Christ. They replaced the church per se with the polity of civic society. They are now the body of Christ, and they are going to reflect their predestined elect status through the changing and the reforming of society. This is why you're going to see Puritans related to the abolitionist movement, the educational reforms, the temperance movement, the feminist movement, all these different things, Puritans, or at least Puritan influence, is going to affect, because deep within this theology is we have to reform societies by reforming ourselves and being pious Christian followers of Jesus Christ, so that we can then build the millennial kingdom, so Christ will come back after that existed for 1,000 years. As I said, these are post-millennialists. And so this is really the New World mentality. This is shaping the American disposition towards authority and towards monarchy and towards kings, right? So even today, it's so common. And we grow up in this water. We swim in this water, that it's really hard to notice this American spirit that is anti-authoritarian or really hierarchical. And Puritanism was shaped by this. They had local congregations that were ruled by the majority. So when a situation came up, 200, 300 people would cast a vote. Whatever the majority ruled that was the decision made, and that was seen as God sort of working within the community. So when we look at evangelical Christianity, this is the continuation of the Puritan mindset and the Puritan ecclesiology. And so this mentality of that democracy is somehow sanctified by God, or you can call it Republican or Democratic, whatever, word you want to use. I have a whole stream breaking down the difference between democracy and republic, looking at Athens and Rome and all this different stuff. But it doesn't matter which adjective or descriptor you want to use. The democracy was viewed by these Puritans as divine system, and what it did was did away with the hierarchical threat that they viewed. So this is a New World mentality versus the Old World mentality. Again, I would argue this is modernism versus pre-modernism. And pre-modernism, the king was there because God wanted him to be there, and if he was good or bad, that was based on the will or the status of the people, and this is a sort of divine judgment. The Puritans aren't interested in this anymore because they're elected. And that's why they had so much animosity with the Arminians, the Arminianism, because that was it Jacobus Arminius of the Netherlands? He was one of these other reformers, and so he believed in free will. This is where you get something like the Methodists adopt more of an Arminianism, that, God has foreknowledge of the future, but you still have free will to affect things, and God's salvation is open to anybody. It's just whether you choose it or not. Well, for these Calvinists and for these Puritans, everything's totally predestined. And so you're either part of the elect or you're not. And Puritan ecclesiology viewed themselves as the elect, and therefore they had a moral obligation to perfect society. And they did this through the democratization of their churches themselves. So remember, Puritans back in England were still part of the Church of England. When they get to New England in America, now they have their ability to structure their own churches. And what do? They totally democratize it. They do not have bishops. They're not interested in authority. But I will say unlike what happens in the Second Great Awakening, that a lot of uneducated people kind of become ministers in the Second Great Awakening, this spiritual revival of Christianity, Puritans were actually very highly educated. And a perfect example is Jonathan Edwards. As I said, he existed between these two worlds of like the old world mentality and the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment comes a little bit later, but it was already influencing that period. Scientific rationalism. I mean, the Royal Society, the official institution of what we consider modern secular science, is in 1660 in England, in London, 1660. So Jonathan Edwards, being essentially a second to third generation American, right? This is before the Revolution. He was highly educated. He wrote actually something on spiders. He was really into what at that time science and natural observation of nature. And so through natural observation, I remember there was a thing that I read at 11 years old. He wrote some type of scientific work explaining how spiders move. Now, it wasn't accurate, but the fact that 11-year-old could write something that would actually be published in the newspaper for the general populace demonstrates how much emphasis education was. And he was not against science. He believed science validated his Puritan Calvinist worldview. But again, he's such an interesting figure because he's right in between what we would consider the Enlightenment deism of the founding fathers and the sort of Scarlet Letter, Salem witch trial, puritanical spirit of the Puritans. He's right in the middle. And this is where we get the First Great Awakening, which we're going to go over today. So to give Jonathan Edwards credit, he published something again at 13 years old. He ended up working under his grandfather, Solomon Studdard, who was the Puritan pastor there in New England. And Jonathan Edwards at like late teens, early 20s was the priest, or the pastor scholar. And he was there basically to give theological answers for questions, not just from other pastors, but also from the general population. So his job was just to be as educated as possible and to read and understand the world as much as possible, and especially his Calvinist theology. He also was, from my reading and looking into him, I'm not a big expert on Jonathan Edwards. So this stream caused me to dive into him because, in my opinion, he was the most iconic figure during this whole movement. And he was, from all intents and purposes, a great husband. He married a woman, I believe her name was Sarah. And from most historians, he was a devoted, loving Christian husband, had multiple children, and was a good father. So even though we get the sort of fire and brimstone, sinners in the hands of an angry God sermon, I'm going to provide a little bit of context on how that was received and what was going on. Because during that time, Jonathan Edwards, again, imagine he's one of the most educated men living in his society at the time. His grandfather, Solomon Studdard, is wanting to get more people to become Puritans. The problem was, to have full membership into the Puritan church in New England, you had to describe, usually through written, usually through written testimony, a conversion experience. And so you could make your confession of faith, you could be a daily attendee to the services, but unless you had some powerful conversion experience, you couldn't be a full member. And so Solomon, Jonathan Edwards' grandfather, he wanted to then democratize the Eucharist. Now, as I'm going to point out, the Puritans, just like the evangelicals, and where the evangelicals get it, is a word-centered worship. It's not a sacramental-centered worship like Orthodoxy or the Catholic Church. It is a word-centered worship, as most Protestants are. But even then, they still had the sacrament of the Eucharist. And Jonathan Edwards actually, obviously we're Orthodox, but to give him credit, he said hell no to his grandfather. And he got kicked out of the church, the community he grew up in, because they voted on him. They kicked him out because he was saying that the Eucharist should only be for members of the church. This is not something that we should democratize and allow people in the street to partake and hoping that they'll begin to come to the church so that we'll have more people in the pews. And his grandfather, he was very much in favor of sort of making it a little bit easier for people to come into the church. So the First Great Awakening, one of the things that propelled it is that Jonathan Edwards, as a Puritan, he is wanting to revive the Christian spirit in America. America was becoming wealthy. You could say, and certain, obviously different from 21st century, but it was becoming a bit decadent. And the second to third generations Americans were not as religiously on fire as their ancestors were. It was kind of they were getting a little bit more moderate Christianity. Their convictions weren't as firm or weren't as fierce. And Jonathan Edwards thought this was a problem because in his Puritan world, they were destined to create the city on the hill. We got to get God's fire lit in these people's butts so they'll start reforming society and make this thing better. And that's part of what the First Great Awakening is. It's providing the opportunity for people to have this conversion experience so that they could then become full members of the Puritan church. Now, there's other denominations. It's not just Puritanism. But for today's stream, Jason requested that we just focus on Puritanism and its influence on early America. So there's that. And so these Puritan Christian communities were totally locally autonomous. As I said, there's no bishops, there's no jurisdictions, there's no dioceses. The communities are completely rooted within democratic consensus, majority rule. Whatever the church community rules as majority, that is it. That is the will of God. The church has spoken. And because of this, church and state are intricately linked because their civil responsibilities are tied to their moral theology. Therefore, there isn't this secularism that we're going to see grow after the founding of the nation from the founding fathers. That's not really there. And in fact, America, as one of the videos I'll show you, they had state churches. That was not, uncommon at the time. But Anyways, so the first one, the number one influence Puritanism has had on contemporary America and the contemporary American mind is this idea that democracy is somehow divinely inspired, and that monarchy and these more ancient systems of governmental structure, these are deleterious, these are authoritarian, these are ways in which the reforming spirit of the Christian becomes entrapped by tradition. And therefore, democracy is the only way in which people can have full liberty. This is part of the Puritan spirit. This is absolutely rooted in America. I mean, when George Bush was talking about, bombing Saddam Hussein, what's he talking about? We're going to make the Middle East democratic. Why? Because America, rooted in the American ethos, is this idea that somehow American democracy or spreading democracy is inspired by God, and we then are living out through these social reforms of instituting democracy in places where it doesn't exist. We are spreading God's dominion on the planet. That is intricately related back to the Puritans who founded this country. Number two, my second point. Now, these are just mine. These 4 points are the ones that I've come up with. So, if you're asking for, what scholar did you read? It's not. These are just my takeaways for my presentation. So, do with that what you will. I would argue number one is democracy over monarchy. Number two is the reform and the revolutionary spirit. And what do I mean by that? As John Winthrop said, America was destined to be the shining city on the hill. This was supposed to be the end point of history. The American, as a historical person, was one that was emancipated from the confines of history. This was the expectation, that the American was somebody who wasn't relegated to historical animosities and historical context, that this was the point in which we could begin new. This was the new Garden of Eden. This is the new Jerusalem. And that language was utilized immensely by the Puritans and other Christians, other Protestants. And it still influences modern evangelical Christianity. And we're going to come back to Zionism and stuff like that here in a bit. But Puritans, as I said, felt, excuse me. Excuse me. Guys, smash that like for everybody who's here. And if you have any questions, you'd like to support the stream, please send in a super chat. In fact, let me create a goal real quick. I don't even have a goal set up. Sorry, something got in my throat. Not sure what that was. We'll make it 20. Okay. Okay. So Puritans felt that the Reformation, as I was talking about regarding the Church of England, did not go far enough, and that they were billed to call a literal utopia, which was the destiny of America, and that through their reforms, they were continually going to perfect society. So for them, and this is where we wouldn't even disagree as Orthodox Christians, they viewed sin, both personal sin, having collective societal consequences. And this is all rooted in, and they were very, very rigid on a moral absolutism, which you could say is totally absent in America. I mean, we now live in a relativistic morality, but to give credit to the Puritans, they had a very strict moral absolutism, and that they believed the transgression of sin not only affected the soul of the individual, which is also Orthodox theology, but they believed that it affected society as a whole, and it brought society to a further and further deleterious place. So therefore, any perceived injustice within society must be reformed. This is where we see the Puritans begin to be vocal about the abolitionist movement. In fact, many abolitionists come from the New England area. And so this is all rooted within, again, their theological vision about moral absolutism, the millenarian destiny of America, and how they got to get their neighbors to get in line, because if you're living a debaucherous life, you're going to cause judgment on the nation. And so this is the same argument you can make about gay marriage, right? What was it, 2012? Gay marriage was legalized. 2014, actually. It's 2014. Gay marriage was 11 years ago, guys. Look where we're at now. They're castrating children and giving them puberty blockers. And people said that's a slippery slope. And then people respond, what happens in your bedroom, doesn't matter. The Puritans, I think, like us conservative traditional Christians, they would say, no, what you do in your bedroom absolutely has an effect on society. We cannot allow this stuff to exist. 2015. Okay. So 14, 15, around there. So they were saying what you do in your bedroom, what you do in your private life absolutely has an influence on society. And we need to curtail these things. We need a society of pious people. So their influence in the abolitionist movement, their influence on feminism, because Puritan women were highly literate, as I talked about, within their Puritan communities, they were encouraged to go seek social reform, go protest, go to different movements, go sit in different places where they're discussing the latest thing that needs to be done. And one of them was the temperance movement. So they saw alcohol as a moral sin. They saw it as essentially a social evil that existed, that it was a social evil that needed to be done away with. And so the moral reformers emphasized self-control, sobriety, and industry. This was how the Puritans, they would, again, advocate for the abolition of not just slavery, but the usage of alcohol, and encourage self-control, sobriety, and industry, and wanted a total societal-wide reform from the moral and social evil of alcohol. Also, the educational reform, right? This is why the Puritans are tied with these huge movements. Educational reform is that Puritans were committed to universal literacy. They believed it to be essential because, again, being Calvinist and believing in, predestination, all these different things, you needed to be literate to read the scripture. If you weren't literate, you probably weren't of the elect. So that's on you. Well, technically it was on God from their worldview, but because of that, you needed to learn how to read so you could actually do your daily scripture reading. In journaling and stuff like this, these spiritual practices that I'll get to in just a second have influenced contemporary evangelical Christianity. So Horace Mann, who's considered the founder of public education in America, literally comes from Puritan New England stock. He comes from these people that settled here for multiple generations, again, imbued with this Puritan worldview about social reform, and then universality. Puritanism it's morally absolute, but it has this universalist ethos because it's so focused on the millennial period. It's focused on creating Christ's millennial kingdom. And so I would say that the second big influence that Puritanism has had in America is this idea that to purify America, to make America better than it had been years previously, we have to continually reform it with new movements, right? For them, it was the abolitionist movement. It was the temperance movement. It was the feminist movement. It was the educational movement. Why were the Puritans behind these? Because we have to reform society to get to the millennial kingdom. And I would argue that that is still absolutely in effect within the American ethos, that Americans are still colored by this revolutionary spirit, that America is a democratically destined gift from God. And because of that, they need to reform, have new movements, change things. I mean, in number 4 here, I'm getting ready to argue that the modern left, the progressive left, is rooted within this Puritan legacy. And that's one of the reasons why they're so interested in social justice, although obviously it's secularized and divorced from Christianity. So that was number 2, the reforms and the revolutionary spirit that underpins America, and that even colors the American Revolution, right? Because why did the Puritans leave England? They left because the monarchy was not allowing the reforms to the Church of England that they wanted. And therefore, they saw America and the New World as an opportunity to start scratch. So number 2 is reforming this revolutionary spirit. Number 3, I would argue, is that Puritanism is the skeletal bones of contemporary evangelical Christianity. Now, there are differences. Obviously, they're not exactly Puritan in the same historical sense. Hey, shout out Slowboy Whiteboard throws in $5. She says, thanks for all your work. Thank you, sister, for the support. God bless you and the family. Appreciate you being here. Appreciate everything you do for the chat, Slowboy Whiteboard. Thank you so much for the support. God bless you, sister. So number 3, Puritanism is the skeletal bones of evangelical Christianity. Puritans emphasized personal inward transformation, that you had to have what they called a spiritual rebirth to be part of their church, what modern evangelicals call being born again. And so as I talked about with Jonathan Edwards and his grandfather, Solomon Studdard, again, there was this huge barrier to entrance into the Puritan community because you had to have a conversion experience. It needed to be profound. It needed to change your life. And this was signifying that you were part of the elect, that you were chosen by God to create this new millennial kingdom, because look at the experience God gave you. That is to show that you were elected. I would argue that this emphasis on almost a charismatic spiritual transformation is the heart of contemporary evangelical Christianity, and this emphasis on being born again and the ecstatic forms of worship. Now, did Puritans have a rock band? Of course not. But this emphasis on this conversion experience has absolutely colored evangelical conversion testimonies. And in the evangelical community, your conversion testimony means a lot. And if you were really, really bad and now you're evangelical, well, look what God did for you. Like, that's a source of pride. And if you were just born evangelical and you really never left the faith and you really never apostatized or anything like that, you really don't have a good conversion testimony, which is really kind of a prestigious thing within the evangelical community. I argue that is rooted within Puritanism. Another one is the word-centered worship, as I mentioned earlier. So Puritans, again, moving away from the Church of England, which was still sacramental at the time. And you even have people like Montague argue that the Anglican Church was ancient. He was trying to argue that the Anglican Church somehow was tied with the first millennial church. Obviously, people dismiss that. You still hear Anglicans try to talk about how they're like Orthodox adjacent and stuff like that. But you actually had people like Montesquieu make those arguments back in the day. But what Puritans did is they moved away from the sacramental focus of liturgical worship and emphasized a word-oriented form of worship where the sermon, the message, was central to the ways in which people were spiritually uplifted. There wasn't a mystery, right? There's not a mystery in the Eucharist. There's not a mystery in the sacraments. The mystery is it's kind of Gnostic in the sense. It's in your rational understanding of things, in your comprehension of the theology and your place within the chosen. So word-centered worship instead of sacraments. What did so the personal these were things that Puritanism focused on regarding your spiritual life that I would argue evangelicals have adopted. Personal Bible reading, daily personal Bible reading. Now, there's nothing wrong. There's, reading your Bible every day is what every Christian should do. Every Orthodox Christian should do. I'm just highlighting the emphasis that the Puritans had. Daily personal Bible reading, journaling your spiritual experiences and your inner thoughts, having reflective prayer / quiet time, and then many of the evangelical modern devotional books actually mimic, if you look at some of the Puritan diaries and meditations from that period that I've talked about, from 1630 essentially to a little bit past the American Revolution. That's kind of their heyday. If you look at their diaries or the way that they constructed a sermon, all of this is repeated within the evangelical community, and they don't hide it. I mean, they literally say that this is look, this is what we're doing. We're connected with the founding of the country. We're connected with the Christian heritage of America. So, this led to independently governed churches. Again, this was a Puritan innovation. There were no democratically local governed churches until the Puritans made this a thing within New England. That is an innovation. That was a novelty at the time, right? Even the Lutherans, they had bishops. They had hierarchy. The Church of England had bishops. They had hierarchy. It's the Puritans who come to America and say, look, we're totally democratizing this thing. We don't want a vertical structure. We want a horizontal structure. And they believe that this was allowed God's grace and God, the Holy Spirit, to influence the body of Christ, the community. And so formal membership within the Puritan community is really the same as the evangelical community. You do have a formal membership. You have to be baptized. You have to make a confession of faith. And though not as much today within the evangelical community as previously, but you had to have some type of conversion experience, or at least a conversion testimony. That was important. And so America was seen as a chosen nation by God, as I've already talked about. And so like Puritans, evangelicals fused their religious millenarianism with a moral theology and civic responsibility. And this is where I come to Zionism, Christian Zionism. That's one of the next streams that I'm getting ready to do. It's a historical overview on Christian Zionism. And when you look at the evangelical community and you see their ahistoricity, right? They're essentially a innovation from an innovation of the Puritans who came here and settled in the New England area, that evangelicals then gain a sort of historical identity through the Old Testament reading of Israel and then modern day Jews. But the emphasis on Christian Zionists to vote for Zionists, to support American defense of Israel, to fund Israel through the billions of dollars we give every year, this mentality, this religious moral mentality tied with the nation state of America and Protestant theology is very, very Puritan. And I would argue that it colors all evangelical Christianity, most Protestant Christianity, for sure. So my third point then, as I was saying, is that Puritanism really is the skeletal bones of contemporary evangelical Christianity. And we see that in the emphasis on the born-again spiritual rebirth, the word-centered worship, the democratized ecclesiology and lack of hierarchy, or even being antithetical to hierarchy itself, is all hierarchy, is all authority is viewed with suspicion. And then number 4, that America is inspired by God, and that those who then participate in the civic life of America are participating almost in a religious sacrament. It's almost a religious sacrament. I mean, for the Puritans, would they put it that way? Probably not, but maybe very close. If you asked your contemporary evangelical, is voting a religious duty? I would suspect at least 50% would probably say yes. 50% would probably say yes. And again, this is that residue from Puritanism. Okay, and now number four. Number four, you're not going to get this one anywhere else because I haven't seen this one fully made. I've seen people use the term puritanical to describe the modern left, but I'm making the case that the fourth great influence Puritanism has had in America is you get the right-wing side or the right of center side, the Evangelical Christian Church, the Christian conservative Evangelical Christian Church. And on the other side of that, you get the secularized Puritanism of the modern left. Now, what do I mean by that? The progressive left has essentially inherited this ideal of moral progress, right? So being a racist, being a misogynist or a sexist or a homophobe or a transphobe, these things are naughty things. And what do they believe that does to the society? It brings society down, almost in, again, a sort of religiously purified understanding. And so moral progress, morality is changing, right? Just as the Puritans believed with slavery, right? Once it was okay, now it's no longer okay. And that they have decided, the Puritan has deciphered absolute morality and then viewing the history of morality as a progressive change to get to their absolute structure. And this is done then through social purification. That's exactly what the left is trying to do. They are trying to socially purify you through the words you use, the people you associate with, the things you look at. All of these things are, I would say, sort of colored by a secular Puritanism. And that's why, in a sense, they're puritanical. Again, that's where that word comes from, is Puritanism. They're puritanical about their progressivism. But progressivism, as I've already highlighted with point number 2, Reform and Revolutionary Spirit, is rooted within the theological doctrines brought here by the Puritans themselves. Does that make sense? So I would argue that the left even believes in a sort of society of elect and reprobates, right? So you and I are reprobates, right? We believe in religion, and we have all these, we believe in the traditional nuclear family, and that women have a unique role in the home, and then men have a unique role to be providers and engaging in society and building things. Well, the modern left sees that as reprobate. That's old, right? You're not up to date with our new moral progress, with our societal reforms, with the new ways in which we envision the world. Therefore, we are part of the elect. You are a reprobate, and in fact, you probably deserve to be canceled through cancel culture. And so does the left still have shaming rituals? Absolutely. The Puritans had shaming rituals. That's what, again, the Scarlet Letter, the Salem witch trials. If you were believed to have been, messing around with herbs in the field, and I'm sure some of the women actually were witches. But we know for a fact that some women were killed or hung during the witch scare. And they were not witches. They were actually maybe just getting herbs and stuff for medicine, or knew how to do certain things. And this puritanical spirit would kill them, would hang them. That is exactly the same sentiment. The intensity of the modern left is very indicative of the intensity of the early Puritans who inhabited the New England area. And then, of course, ritual purification. Public confession of your sins. You have to apologize. You said the N-word as a joke 12 years ago. Get on your knees and profess your loyalty to the new moral progressive ethos and apologize. And then they go through the ritual, right? Everybody has seen various public figures have to go through the ritual, and now you're cleansed of your sins, right? You've made your sort of a ritualistic confession. You've atoned collectively and among the community or the public for what you've done wrong, your transgression. And so, and then, like I said, cancel culture of the modern left, the idea that you just shut people out from the town square. I mean, Puritans were into that. Now, again, as an Orthodox Christian, I'm okay with blasphemy laws. I mean, the Puritan, like stuff like this, that Puritans probably would have been on par with. So I don't mean to over dramatize the Puritans as everything that they viewed or everything they supported was wrong. I'm just trying to highlight the continuity between some of their thoughts and contemporary America. But cancel culture, it's very Puritan, that the society has to be purified. And if you violate that purity, you need to be out. You're out. You cannot contribute to the town square. You're out. You're out. You're okay. You're gay. You're out. That type of thing. So, Puritans, one of the things that they did was police speech. That was one of the things that I found, because I started to dive in to see like what connections can I make with the Puritan Christians and contemporary modern left. One of the things that I found is that they police speech to enforce ideological orthodoxy, the Puritan theology. And now, if you just replace, Reformed Calvinist Puritan theology with the modern progressive left, it's the same thing. They're policing your speech to make sure that you're in ideological conformity with what they deem as orthodox. And so you have to use certain pronouns. You have to use certain words. You have a wife? No, you have a partner. You have a partner, okay? Be a little considerate for the LGBTQ plus community that's also here at this conference. This type of thing, that, you have to refer to people by their right pronoun. Why? Because if I refer to a woman who's identifying as a man, as a she, I'm forcing reality to confront this sort of social construction, right? This ideological conformity. Very, very Puritan. And so I thought of like 3 different phrases that's used by the modern left and how they might be able to be interpreted from a Puritan perspective. And so first one is, check your privilege. Will you just you're a white, straight man. Check your privilege right now. Okay? You have a history of racism, patriarchy, and oppression. Checking your privilege is, like, in my mind, equal to confessing your depravity, right? So they believed in total depravity. These were Calvinists, right? Again, learn your tulip, the five characteristics of Calvinism. They believed in total depravity. And so is that not a correlation? Is like confess, check your privilege, meaning check all the things that anybody who has looked like you or even mildly tangentially related to you, all the bad things they did, you better recognize that. And that's like the Puritan saying, confess your depravity, right? You are nasty. You're a gross human creature. You need God's grace, right? You need the grace of the social justice warriors. Another one is, we just need to do the work. Do the work. Well, what is do the work? Well, that means like being an ally. That was actually the next one I have. Do the work of social justice, do the work of social reform. Again, central to the Puritan Christian worldview. I equate that with sanctify yourself through praxis. That's how the Puritan would view it, is that if you want to know if you're of the elect, you want to know if you're predestined for heaven, well, you better work it out right now through praxis, buddy. You better be reading your Bible. You better be doing your prayers. You better be treating people nice. You better be doing everything you need to do. And that's how you demonstrate your elect status. And it's like, that's exactly. So we have to do the work. We have to participate in their social reforms, or somehow, again, we're a reprobate. We're outside the orthodoxy. We're outside this moral ethos. And then the last one I have is be an ally. They always say, be an ally. I'm an ally for the LGBTQ community. What? Be an ally. I equate that to witness to the elect cause, right? So the social justice, the progressive left, they are the elect. They've taken institutional power. They are the CEOs. They are the professors. They run the universities and the institutions. And therefore, the Puritan would say, look, witness to the elect cause. You need to do what we're doing because we're the elect. We're the ones that are predestined for heaven. If you want to get into heaven, you need to follow us. And I would say that ethos, that mentality is totally consistent with the modern left. So that was a long-winded, roundabout way to open. I did not expect to go over an hour. I apologize. I literally thought that my opening statement would be about 20 to 30 minutes. We're now at an hour and 10 minutes. So I hope that was useful. Sorry for all that that long-windedness. I probably could have said that in more brevity. I don't know, but hopefully that was useful. So now we got a bunch of stuff. I got notes, show notes on it. We're not going to go through the whole thing. And I got a handful of videos that are kind of going to go over many of the things that I just mentioned to you. So, Keenan throws in $5. Thank you so much, Keenan Beach. Shout out to him. He says, Dr. David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos, where exactly do you think their democratic/liberal ideas came from? The Enlightenment? No, it's pre-Enlightenment. It's pre-Enlightenment. Their allegiance to democracy is not so much about, because I mean, the French Revolution is later. You know, the second big wave of Puritans is in 1630. You know, the American Revolution was really indicative of like right being squared right in the Enlightenment period. That's 1776. So that's like 140 years away. And so where they're getting this idea of democracy is through the parliamentary system in England, which is part of the English Civil War, is that they're battling between, you know, Charles I, for example, son of James I. He believes that the king has right to do anything he wants. Everybody must submit to his will because he's divinely appointed by God. You can, again, I'm no fan of Charles I. I don't think he was a great king. He's the one that was beheaded by the parliamentarians. So the parliamentarians over here, you have the royalists who are in favor of the monarchy, generally speaking, much more in favor of Catholicism and the way that the Church of England, the Anglican Church already was. So they're okay with vestments. They're okay with the crucifix. They're okay with the Book of Common Prayer. They're okay with all this different stuff. The Puritans, on the other hand, they want to purify it. They want to do away with it. And so the battle between doing, you know, the parliamentarians actually do away with the monarchy during the English Civil War. And so that, I would argue, already set the basis for it being inspiring these Puritans to say, look, we don't need a king. We've governed ourselves for a decade without a king here in England. We don't need it. And the Puritans see this. And they're like, we don't need a king. We don't need a hierarchy. We don't need bishops. We don't need these vertical structures of authority and power. We need to democratize all this stuff. We need to totally decentralize. And so they go from one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum. And so were they liberal? It depends on how you use that word. Were they reformers? Absolutely. And I would generally equate a sort of liberalism with a sense of reform. It is tied with a sort of Enlightenment revolutionary spirit, but they're before the Enlightenment. They're before the Enlightenment. So you can't say that they were liberal, like a classical liberal. The Puritans weren't classical liberal. They were, and this is why I'm saying that the Puritans really exist, and Jonathan Edwards as an indicative figure, between two worlds. They exist between this old world monarchy and religious identity in this new Enlightenment system. And they're right in between where they're like trying to figure out how to maneuver and how to repackage these things together. And so they want the old world intensity of religion and religious focus, but they want a new world mentality where there is no monarch. Everything is decentralized. It's about the will of the people. It's about being able to self-govern yourself. And it's about your interior state related to God. And then through praxis, demonstrating your elect status. So I would argue that's where their fervor for democracy of that sort. And it is just straight democracy. I mean, the way the Puritans governed themselves was majority rule, right? So it wasn't like, you know, the American Republican Democratic structure. But that's why we get that, right? So those people, you think of the founding fathers. I mean, they're coming out of a cultural milieu of people who are inspired this way. And this is one of the reasons why, when you look at the period of the American Revolution, the churches that supported the revolution the most were the ones that were most democratized. And the Anglican Church, for example, there's multiple examples of like Anglican priests having to shut down their churches because they were royalists. They supported because they were old world. They believed that the monarch was divinely appointed and that any revolution against the monarch is anti-biblical. That was even the Anglicans that came to America. That was kind of their perspective. Generally speaking, there's always exceptions where you had the Puritans who from the beginning were not interested in ever having a sort of monarchy, and were not interested in hierarchical structure. Jason, actually, shout out to Jason for sponsoring today's stream. Thank you so much, Jason. God bless you, brother. He says, thanks for doing my topic. How would you say the Puritan concept of sin is different from the Orthodox one? Well, I would say a big difference between the way that they conceptualize sin is it has to do with their Calvinism and being predestined, right? So for us, sin is a willful turning away from God and a dissipation of God's energies within us. For the Puritan, sin was the natural state of everybody except for the elect who strove to move beyond their corrupted human flesh. And there is no understanding of these energies. There is no, again, and this predestination is essential, because if you weren't predestined, it didn't matter how much sin you got rid of, you're not making it to heaven. God already made his decision, and you're not on the list, bud. So their understanding of sin is, it has a different soteriology than ours. So our understanding of salvation is that everybody is under the same process. We're all dealing with the same fallen human nature. Everybody has the law written on their heart, according to St. Paul. And then the Orthodox Church is the hospital for humanity. And we then, our understanding of sin is therapeutic, right? Their understanding of sin was very legalistic. And that's why they felt like that civic society, their civic responsibility and their moral theology had a fuse, because it's not so much about a healing of the person. It's about a purifying of the civic space from anything that could taint it. So I would say that's probably one of the big differences between their concept of sin and ours is a therapeutic process. Christ heals us. The hospital heals us, the church. The sacraments heal us. They don't have that same sacramental theology. They are healed by demonstrating their elect status, and they're already chosen. And then those who are not part of them, those who aren't Puritans, are not chosen, and they're just going to have to deal with their consequences. So, and then Snagglebeast. Snagglebeast's been a member for 17 months. Thank you so much, brother. He says, good day and God bless. Awesome news. I'm about to be received next month in the Carpatho-Russian diocese. Well, wonderful. You and Jay debunked my prot theology. Well, glory to God, Snagglebeast. That's great to hear. God bless you on your journey, my man. Thank you very much for the support and for being a COTEL crew member. Let's see here. Anything on the dono chat? No. And we're going to dive into, and then over on Streamlabs, William throws in $20. Thank you so much, William. He says, been watching your stuff for around a year now. After 19 years of New Age / atheism and a year of inquiry, I'm now a catechumen in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Well, glory to God, William. That's great. Can't thank you enough. Well, I'm humbled, and I'm sure Jay would say the same thing for Snagglebeast or you, William. If we have helped you in any way find your way to the Orthodox Church, glory be to God. We're humbled if we helped. So thank you very much for your support, my man. I do appreciate that. Again, I got a few. I'm going to just show you guys my notes section here real quick. We're not going to go over the whole thing. Much of it, again, my long-winded monologue to open the stream, I think covered most of it. So as we said, background, English Reformation, 1530s to 1550s. This is kind of the founding of Puritanism. After King Henry broke from Rome, it retained many of its Catholic structures, which frustrated the reform-minded Protestants. Puritans were those who wanted to purify, as we already talked about. yada, yada, yada. Under Elizabeth I and James I, Puritans grew increasingly discontent, although they were not persecuted. Again, they come here being funded by the Brits. They're saying, look, just go over there. We're going to create an economic compact. Essentially what they did, they created an economic contract where you're going to go over to the New World. You can start your own communities, but you're also going to work for us and trade with us so that we can get goods from the New World. And they're like, okay, deal. It really isn't until Charles I that we see real persecution of the Puritans. So first Plymouth colony, 1620. Again, they were known as separatists back in England, known as pilgrims who came to America. Mayflower Compact, again, a document of self-government and covenantal society, right? So they believed in this covenantal theology of society. The Great Migration, that's 1630. That's when we get 20. I read something that said 30,000. So I put 20,000 because that's the number often referenced, but I saw up to 30,000 migrated to the Massachusetts area. And then a theocratic covenant society. They're very theocratic in structure. Church and civil governance were intertwined. Church membership was required for voting and civic participation. So again, you can see how the civic life and the church were tied up together. Predestination, emphasis on biblical literacy, visible saints, everything that I said. And one of the things I didn't say was, again, Puritans were the ones that founded Harvard College in 1636. And then when Harvard began to, what the Puritans viewed to become too liberal, they founded another one called Yale. So Yale and Harvard are both founded by these Puritan communities. Congregationalists, autonomous local churches. Oh, the Halfway Covenant of 1662. So this is what I was mentioning. It was basically a compromise that allowed partial church membership for the unconverted children of saints, meaning they had not yet have their conversion experience yet. So you couldn't be a full member, but it allowed the baptism of children. This was a controversial document, the Halfway Covenant. It's not really that important. The decline of Puritanism. By the late 17th century, a new generation lacked the same zeal. This is where we get the First Great Awakening now, right? Kind of that mid 17th century. And then the Halfway Covenant, we marked that. A confession minus the conversion experience. And then the rise of secularism, economic prosperity. That's one of the factors here that it was really a historical phenomenon, is that when places become wealthy, they lose their religious fervor. Places that are persecuted tend to have much higher religious commitments. That's just a general trend. So the rise of secularism, economic prosperity, Enlightenment rationalism contributed to the weakening of Puritan orthodoxy. And then here's a historical timeline. We're going to watch a video that kind of goes over some of this stuff, but 1534, Act of Supremacy. King Henry breaks from Rome, establishes the Church of England. 1558 through 1603 is the Elizabethan settlement. Queen Elizabeth solidifies the Anglican Church. This is where we get the Roanoke colony. 1560s, early Puritan activity. Puritans push for elimination of vestments, more biblical preaching, congregational church governance. They wanted the preacher. They believed that the priest should dress in like academic, secular garb, academic, educational, essentially a suit, which is exactly how the evangelical community dresses today, right? There are no vestments. There is no ornate garments that the religious leaders wear. Just like the Puritans, they were to dress as somebody who was like an intellectual or an academic. And that's what they do. They dress as businessmen. They wear suits. So let's see. James I comes to the throne. We talked a little bit about that. Great Migration. John Winthrop, City Upon a Hill. 1636, Harvard College. Again, two people, Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, exiled. They challenged the Puritan orthodoxy in New England, and they're kicked out and create the state of Rhode Island and allow for more religious diversity. Puritanism and decline and transformation. Salem witch trials kind of undermined the fervor by some of the Americans in the country. Yale College founded, as I said, 1701 to combat Harvard's liberalization, which is ironic, right? So if you connect my fourth characteristic of the modern left with a Puritan spirit but secularized, you can see the universities of Yale and Harvard be, at the leading forefront of this sort of puritanical social justice movement and creating priests of social justice to go out and inhabit various business or, strata in society and influence it. Then you have the First Great Awakening, 1730s. I would actually say the 50s here, 1730s to the 1750s. Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God, George Whitefield, and others promote evangelical renewal. I have a thing on the First Great Awakening, so we'll check that out if you guys are interested. Let me know if you want to watch it. And then the Puritan legacy in the 19th century. By the time of the Second Great Awakening, it's massively on the decline. Puritanism as an actual strong religious community. Revivalism spreads across America. While more populist than Puritanism, it retains emphasis on sin and conversion, personal morality, revival of covenant language, especially in the North. Abolitionist movement. So 1830s to 1860s, right before the Civil War, we see Puritans. And again, many were influenced by descendants of Puritans. Some of the influential people weren't exactly quote unquote members of a Puritan community, but they come from those people. Mid 1800s, transcendentals and liberal theologians emerge. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Theodore Parker. They view Puritan orthodoxy, or they reject it, but are shaped by its moral seriousness and stuff like that. And then what I found today in the 21st century is there's like a movement called New Calvinism or New Neo-Puritanism. I am not even familiar with these guys. I just found them by doing research online. John Piper, Mark Dever, Tim Keller, Kevin DeYoung. They all promote Puritan theology, church discipline, biblical exposition, and family-centered piety. So Puritanism is, according, at least in some small evangelical circles, making a sort of rise again today. And then I was going to talk a little bit about, again, this will be available at the website, but I'm actually getting ready to launch my new school community later this week. So all of my stuff, I can't wait to show you guys my new school community. It's literally Logos Academy. I'm super excited to launch it, but that's going to come later this week. So Puritanism and progressive social movements, the temperance movement, Puritans emphasize self-control, as I mentioned this earlier. First wave feminism and women's suffrage. Ironically, although the Puritan society was patriarchal, it promoted literacy among women so that they could read the Bible, planting seeds of intellectual empowerment. The moral agency upheld the idea that women had an important moral role in shaping the household and community. That was the big one, is that many were okay with women shaping the household and educating the children. It's the Puritan community that emphasized women going and participating in these social reforms. This translated into moral leadership and reform movements. Many women entered public life through moral reforms, such as anti-slavery and temperance, then progressed to women's rights. Notable figures, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, leaders of women's suffrage movement, were deeply involved in abolitionism and temperance before advocating for voting rights. Educational reform, mentioned Horace Mann. I mentioned that earlier. So here's some of the continuity between modern evangelical Christianity and Puritanism, but I kind of covered that in point 3 of my characteristics, so we're going to skip that. Here's a little graph I put together, so this may help. Sacraments, serious, reverent, and covenantal for the Puritans, often seen as symbolic and less central for modern evangelicals. So as I said, Puritans still had, again, it was a word-centered worship. It was not sacramentally centered, but they did take it seriously. As I mentioned with Jonathan Edwards actually arguing against his grandfather. Ecclesiology, covenant community with strict discipline, more individualistic, less emphasis on membership, theological depth, deeply intellectual and catechetical. I mean, you have to at least give it to the Puritans. They were incredibly educated people. The evangelicals often criticized for being shallow and anti-intellectual. So interesting difference there. view of the world, suspicious of worldliness and pleasure. Evangelicals more open to culture and media, i.e. the mega churches. And then liturgical simplicity, solemn, austere, sermon-centered, and then diverse from charismatic to seeker-sensitive styles, but still word-oriented. The last one I want to show you guys, though, is my section on the political left. And so, as I said, it is a sort of secularized Puritanism. I keep saying Protestantism. Puritanism. And so belief in moral progress, social purification, all the stuff I said, the elect and the reprobate, shaming rituals, cancel culture, Inquisition 2.0, like the Puritan communities that expelled dissenters. Modern activists often seek to identify or expel the impure from their social justice circles. They police speech like the Puritans did, and they use public shame as a means of enforcing communal values. Wokeism as secular sanctification. Many progressive movements operate as if pursuing personal and collective sanctification. And then those are the three little phrases I came up with. So anyways, I don't want to belabor all the notes. Again, if you want to get access to these essentially a study guide, again, become a website member or just hold off for a few days and join my new Logos Academy. I promise you'll be worth it. Okay. Now, with that being said, I do want to give another shout out to Jason for sponsoring today's stream. Thank you so much, Jason. And I told him I would give his podcast, The Unsung Substack, a shout out today. And if you guys would like to check out Jason's podcast, you can do so with this link right here. Actually, Jason just threw in $10. Thank you so much, Jason. It says Theodore Parker was one of the Secret Six who funded and supported John Brown in his attack on Harper's Ferry to instigate a slave revolt. Emerson and Thoreau were also big fans of John Brown. Oh, interesting. Interesting. And then Jason followed up and said Susan B. Anthony's brother Dan was a Kansas Jayhawker in the late 1850s and during the Civil War. Super violent guy. Yeah. Well, and even the misnomer that Puritans didn't have slaves is false. That was one of the things that I found doing the research for the stream, was that it wasn't as common, but yeah, Puritans still had slaves in certain circumstances. They were just expensive. But it is, I mean, but they were instrumental behind the abolitionist movement, and this Reformed theology colored everything. So everything's just more gray than black and white, generally speaking. All right. Let's get into some of our videos here. So this one right here is pretty interesting. This one is, it talks about how the South became insanely religious. Now, it took me forever to try to find some type of visual to use for today's stream, because almost everything talking about Puritanism is so incredibly boring. There aren't like a lot of cool, interesting videos per se. This one isn't specifically about Puritans, but it's about how Puritans coming to America and then how the sort of religious landscape of America is presented in the contemporary day. I assume it's kind of presented by a left of center guy, but the graphics and everything are pretty good on it. And then as I was talking about regarding the history and the historical context, if you guys are interested, this video does a pretty good job of providing a sort of historical context of everything that I was saying to you guys. And so if you're interested in that, I got multiple videos. Some of these are long. This one's 28 minutes. This is from a scholar who's from the Gordon Cornwell Theological Seminary. I believe it's in South Carolina or somewhere around there. This guy named Ryan Reeves, and his YouTube channel, he has some pretty good educational videos. He doesn't make them very often, like this one's from 10 years ago. But it is, again, kind of boring. The way he speaks is boring, but it is a great overview of the First Great Awakening. So we can go over that. And I thought one of the cool things about his video on the Second Great Awakening was the section on apocalyptic movements and how the anticipation of the end days really gets imbued with the burgeoning evangelical Christian community, right? So, the Left Behind series and their focus on the end times and their accelerationism toward the end times through their devotion towards the secular, semi-secular state of Israel. I would argue that a lot of that gets going through the Second Great Awakening. And so this little section on the apocalyptic movements, I would like to show you that. Although it's not specifically about Puritanism, it is about how Christianity has been shaped by some of these movements. Keenan says, I actually love Ryan Reeves. I've watched hours and hours of his videos. Yeah, they're quality content. It's quality content. Is it the most engaging content? No. And I could imagine if I just played all his videos, I would probably lose some of my audience. But I do want to play some of it because he does have great information in his stuff. And then here was a little article that I read, one of them that I read in preparation for today. So I can share that link if you guys are interested. It's just one. I was reading a bunch of different stuff, but I didn't put it all together for the stream. So if you're interested, here's the link on this article. But I think first, just to bring it all full circle, we're going to watch the video. I think this is probably the most engaging of the videos. And this one kind of lays out the entire kind of Christian framework of America. So let me play this and I bet I have all these turned to like 2.0. So we'll do 1.25 so we can get through more of it. So here's the first one.
This is a map showing the percentage of adults who are highly religious per state. Looking at it, you'll notice this southern region over here is much more distinct than the rest. In fact, it's so distinct, it even has its own name, the Bible Belt. Protestant Christianity plays a strong role in society here, and church attendance across the denominations is much higher than the nation's average. But why is that? Why is this part of America so much more religious than the rest? I mean, New England was literally founded by Puritans who thought Europe was too godless, and is now the most atheistic region in the Union. So what's happened? Well, to understand this religious flip-flop and the intensity of it in the South, we need to go all the way back to the beginning. And I mean, back to the literal founding of the 13 colonies themselves, with the first one being Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. Like with many other European powers at the time, economic reasons were the best way to sum up the motivations for colonization, and the British colonizing North America was no different. So people were sent to live in this area to establish a British settlement here, and since they came from England, where the Church of England, aka the Anglican Church, was the official state religion, the people who made up this region were mostly Anglican. The thing is though, the Church of England at this point in time had only been separated by the Roman Catholic Church and turned into a Protestant Anglican country since 1534. And even then there were some brief restorations of Catholicism, like under the reign of Queen Mary I from 1553 to 1558. So the point I'm trying to make is, even though the Church of England was technically Anglican, there were still many retained elements of Catholicism in it. And this is where the Puritan movement became a thing, because they were a group of people who wanted to purify the church from what they viewed as Catholic practices, and to implement a more rigorous form of worship and church governance. But the thing is, their efforts and beliefs caused tension and persecution, causing them to flee the country and to create a society in the manner they believed God truly intended it to be designed. So from 1620 to 1640, there was a Puritan migration to the New England colonies of British America, with as many as 20,000 of them making the trip over, mostly in families as opposed to isolated individuals, and establishing the now Plymouth colony, the second permanent English colony in America after Jamestown. So at this point in time, there was basically a religious divide between Puritanism in the north and the Anglicans in the south. This was reflected in their living too, with the Puritans establishing a society deeply rooted in their faith, with strict moral codes and a focus on community worship. The Puritans' influence was so profound that it permeated nearly every aspect of life in New England, from governance to daily routines. Meanwhile, in the south, and it's not to say they weren't religious at all, because they certainly were, but their motivation for the settlement was largely economic from the start, focused on agriculture, trade, and that sort of stuff. The establishment of the Anglican Church in these colonies was part of replicating English societal structures and maintaining loyalty to the crown. There were also a mix of other denominations among settlers too, meaning that there was no one central religious identity that held all the power. So as a result, the societal structure in southern states like Virginia were more hierarchical and less centered around religion compared to the Puritan North. Then things started to change.
Is the video too fast for you guys? I mean, I listen to videos at 2.0, 1.5 regularly. So I can't tell because I'm used to it. But I always get comments about how things are moving too fast. Do you want me to put it at normal speed? Or is 1.25 okay? Crispy says it's okay. Make it faster. Okay. See, I do it super fast. It's not fast, Grandpa. Okay.
You see, while the original Puritan settlers were this very religious bunch, as time passed, the second and third generations of settlers, who were born in the New World, didn't always share the same intensity of religious conviction or the sense of urgency that drove their ancestors. Some even started to become disinterested in it for all the adherence it required. And as the colony began to develop more, economic prosperity started to take precedence over religious matters for many people. The once religiously unified society also started to see a migration of people with different backgrounds and beliefs over time, diluting the Puritan influence and their ability to enforce religious conformity. It was these things that led to the rise of secularism in New England. Now, you may be thinking, wouldn't the South be affected by these things too? And you'd be right, it did. But ironically, being less religiously intense actually helped preserve Christianity there. Let me explain. Because the South was less homogeneously religious, it meant that over time evolved a form of Christianity that was more intertwined with everyday life and less rigid than Puritanism, allowing for a more flexible adaptation of religious practices to changing social conditions. This helped sustain its influence, leading religion in the South to become a part of the cultural identity, beyond just theological obedience. Along with this, there was also a geographical factor at play. While both regions started off with agriculture as the main business, the geography and climate of New England is less conducive to large-scale agriculture than those of the South. New England has rocky soil, a relatively rugged terrain, and a shorter growing season, making large-scale farming more challenging. In contrast, the South has more fertile soil and a longer growing season, which supports large plantations. This meant that New England's economy diversified early on. Fishing, shipbuilding, and trade were significant economic activities alongside farming. The region's abundant water power from its rivers was also a key factor in its early industrialization. New England became a center for manufacturing, with industries like textiles and clockmaking growing rapidly from the end of the 18th century. And this industrial growth spurred urban development as people moved to cities for factory jobs. So while the South did care about their economy, obviously, they were and have been able to maintain a more agricultural focus, having been initially based on cash crops like tobacco, cotton, and rice, which relied heavily on slave labor.
Cheap slave labor on vast tracts of land owned by the planter.
And this agricultural focus created a much different economic trajectory compared to the North's industrialization, with theirs starting much later, particularly after the Civil War. Obviously, the impact on religion of this was also key. The more rural and agricultural nature of much of the South for a longer period helped maintain a traditional, community-centered way of life, where the church played a significant role, whereas the industrialization, and hence urbanization of the North, led to the growth of public education, which often led to increased exposure to diverse viewpoints and a greater emphasis on secularism. Now, I realize I basically just time jumped from the beginning and development of these 13 colonies to the end of the Civil War, but it was also everything that happened between these two time periods that heavily contributed to making the US South much more religious than the North. Simply put, the Great Awakening, a series of religious rivals. Now, like I said before, the South was affected by the same things as the North, just to a lesser degree due to the reasons mentioned above. So religion wasn't in a great place across all the colonies. A lot of this was due to the rise of the Age of Enlightenment, an intellectual and philosophical movement that occurred in Europe from the end of the 17th century. Enlightenment thinkers wanted to improve human conditions on Earth rather than concern themselves with religion and the afterlife. These thinkers valued reason, science, religious freedom, and what they called natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Naturally, the Enlightenment movement made its way across the Atlantic too, to the 13 colonies. In many ways, religion was becoming more formal and less personal during this time, which led to lower church attendance. Churches couldn't keep up with population growth. Christians were feeling complacent with their methods of worship, and some were disillusioned with how wealth and rationalism were dominating culture. The colonies were still deeply religiously divided at this point too, with the Puritans in the north, the Anglicans in the south, and the middle colonies basically a mix of everything, from Quakers to Lutherans to Baptists to Presbyterians, and a few other denominations too. This all set the stage for the First Great Awakening, starting from 1730 to 1755, though some place the beginning of it as early as 1720 and even the end of it as 1770. In response to these trends, ministers influenced by New England Puritanism, Scots-Irish Presbyterianism, and European Pietism began calling for a revival of religion and piety. The blending of these three traditions would produce an Evangelical Protestantism that placed greater importance on, quote, seasons of revival, or outpourings of the Holy Spirit, and on converted sinners experiencing God's love personally. This movement, sweeping across the colonies, marked a stark departure from the more reserved religious practices of the past, and it was brought to the forefront by passionate preachers like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. George Whitefield, an English minister, traversed the colonies, captivating immense crowds with his powerful and emotional sermons. He had a unique ability to connect with his audience on a deeply personal level, often moving them to tears or spiritual awakening. Similarly, Jonathan Edwards, preacher from New England, made a long-lasting, influential impact with his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, emphasizing God's wrath upon believers after death to a very real, horrific, and fiery hell. Edwards' methods of preaching was characterized by vivid imagery and a passionate delivery that appealed directly to the emotions and fears of his listeners. This period of revivalism, driven by such charismatic preaching, was not just about religious teachings. It was an emotional experience that deeply resonated with the masses. Many sources from this time report people falling into trances, being struck down to the ground, or crying uncontrollably. And even though this was at the time during slavery and extreme racism, these preachers made sure to preach to anyone who would listen, breaking the traditional barriers of class and race in religious practice, and of course, spreading their religion widely. However, this shift towards emotive spirituality was controversial, leading to significant divisions within the religious communities. The awakening gave rise to two distinct groups, the Old Lights and the New Lights. And yes, this all relates to the modern-day divide. But basically, the Old Lights, made up of the Puritans, Baptists, and Presbyterians, rejected the revival movement, saying it wasn't true religion, but rather just a theatrical experience. Meaning the New Lights embraced this revivalist movement. They viewed the emotional experiences and passionate preaching as genuine manifestations of divine power and a necessary revival of true Christian faith. As you might have guessed by now, in the North, the Old Light was strong enough to largely maintain their hold. Meanwhile, in the South, the New Light, aka Evangelicism, took off like wildfire. The Baptist and Methodist churches became dominant here. In these churches, there was less reliance on religious authority all the way through. While the Old Light churches thought that extensive education was necessary to interpret the Bible correctly, the New Light ones were more inclined to say that its meaning could be understood by anyone. If you were a farmer back then and felt called to preach and could gather a congregation, then you were already a minister. So there were a lot more Baptist preachers than any other denomination. And the South at this time was very rural, so this idea appealed strongly to people who might not have regular access to a church. This, combined with the inclusive message of offering salvation to all regardless of social status and race, resonated deeply in the hierarchical society of the South. These denominations grew rapidly in the South, establishing a strong evangelical presence more fully into the daily lives and identities of people across different social classes. In the North, even with the rejection of the movement, its emphasis on personal experience and questioning of authority in religious matters laid early influence for individualism and a questioning attitude in the North, which, combined with the region's focus on education and commerce, gradually led to a more secular society. That was just the first Great Awakening too. There were still two, arguably three more after this. By the time the Second Great Awakening started, which was in about 1795, the United States had already officially become an independent country. The beginning of the Industrial Revolution had also very recently started in the US, and the Age of Enlightenment, even though it had started decades ago, was only reaching its peak around this time. So these two things combined to mark an increase in secularism and focus on the contemporary world and science. While the First Great Awakening focused more on existing members of the church, the second focused on attracting new members. So to re-engage worshippers and attract new members, evangelical denominations again began to hold active, energetic tent revivals where faith was renewed. The earliest of the tent revivals focused on the Appalachian frontier, but they quickly moved into the area of the original colonies. These weren't small revival meetings either. Thousands would meet up at a time. Revival meetings were not restricted to the frontier or to white people though. In many areas, particularly the South, black people had separate revivals at the time. The Baptists and Methodists often worked together in these revivals, with both religions believing in free will with personal redemption. The Baptists were highly decentralized with no hierarchical structure in place, and preachers lived and worked among their congregation, while the Methodists, on the other hand, had more of an internal structure in place. They had people traveling on horseback all over, converting people to the Methodist faith, and it paid off. By the 1840s, the Methodists were the largest Protestant group in America. Just to put all these efforts into perspective, they grew from 58,000 members in 1790 to 258,000 in 1820, and then to 1,661,000 by 1860. This growth factor of over 28 times in 70 years outpaced the national population growth, which increased by a factor of just 8 during the same period. The most significant revivalist in this area was the Presbyterian minister Charles Finney. A key change he made was in promoting mass conversions during revival meetings. No longer were individuals converting alone. Instead, they were joined by neighbors, converting en masse. In 1839 alone, Finney...
I just got a comment on that art. looks like they're drowning the guy, and this is a depiction of some of the revivalist movements where they had mass baptisms. I saw that. I thought, looks like they're killing him. They're not trying to save him.
Instead, they were joined by neighbors, converting en masse. In 1839 alone, Finney preached in Rochester, New York, and made an estimated 100,000 converts. But the Second Great Awakening ended in 1840 due to the deep culture of slavery in the South, leading to the division of northern versus southern religious sects during the 1830s and 1840s. In fact, in 1845, Southern Baptists split from the National Baptist denomination in the US and established the pro-slavery Southern Baptist Convention, as they interpreted the Bible as supporting slavery. In technicality, the Third Great Awakening actually started from 1855, with the Civil War happening not much after this, from 1861 to 1865, and the eventual movement ending in the 1930s. It was also near the end of this movement when the term Bible Belt started to be used in media. This Great Awakening didn't really have a profound impact on the growth of Christianity in the South and the decline of it in the North as the first two. It was marked by a more promotion of social activism. This was seen, for example, with the founding of the Salvation Army, the rise of the YMCA. Don't get me wrong though, it was still growing rapidly during this time. In the South especially, many intellectuals of that era took part in the movement and were strong advocates of Christianity. They tried to systematically reach the parts of the country where there were no churches and spread the religion. Some of these intellectuals and scholars started building schools and universities that were closely tied to Christianity, which of course has had a lasting influence over a century later. As a result, the Protestant churches in the United States were growing at extreme speeds during this period. Though, like everything else, it was met with an opposite force that was just as powerful: the rise of scientific thought. Particularly, the theory of evolution and higher criticism of the Bible began to challenge the traditional religious beliefs that supported the awakening. With a further rise in industrialization and urbanization everywhere, especially in the South after the Civil War, and a whole world war a couple decades after that, the priorities of religion became slightly more on the back burner. This shift towards modernism and critical approach to religious texts gradually eroded the foundation of the Third Revivalist movement. So at this point in the timeline, there's been three Great Awakenings which created and heavily promoted evangelicism everywhere, especially in the South. And we're not done yet, arguably. While the concept of a fourth Great Awakening is heavily debated among historians based on if it had an impact equivalent to the first three to warrant the same title, what it certainly did do was cement the South as the region of the very religious people in the US. Having started in the beginning of the 1960s till 1980, this timeline lined up with the growth of the radio and television, which, when used for religious broadcasting and evangelism, played a significant role in spreading religious messages and connecting believers. There's even a word for it: televangelism. Keep in mind that farming in the South remained independent far longer than it did for the rest of the country, so small isolated communities got their hands on radios and were connected to a much larger world. Within a single generation of early rural radio, you see the rise of someone like Billy Graham, who is now seen as the evangelist of the 20th century, and arguably the direct link between the controversial Fourth Great Awakening to the present day. Being part of the Southern Baptists, he is a big reason it's now the world's largest Baptist denomination, and the largest Protestant and second largest Christian denomination in America. In the Bible Belt, Graham's evangelist crusades reinforced and revitalized evangelical Christian beliefs. His large-scale events and dynamic preaching style focusing on a personal relationship with God resonated deeply with the region's religious culture. His crusades through mass media reached millions, increasing the visibility and appeal of evangelicism. This heightened interest laid the groundwork for the growth of large evangelical churches. The mainline Protestant churches weakened sharply in both membership and influence, while the most conservative religious denominations, like the Southern Baptists, grew rapidly in numbers and spread across the United States. Soon, with so many members, megachurches came to be, and they won attention for the simple reason that 10 churches with 2,000 members were more visible than 100 churches with 200 members. So now we go to the modern day. Both Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, the most Southern recent US presidents, were raised in the Southern Baptist Church. In states like Alabama and Mississippi, 51% and 49% of adults attend religious services at least once a week. This contrasts sharply with states in the North like Maine and Vermont, where figures are 22% and 21%, as well as states in literally any other region, like Oregon in the West at 29% and North Dakota in the Midwest at 33%. However, there's more hidden factors at play here that I haven't explained yet. Because the North industrialized faster and really didn't have to rely on agriculture as much, they are richer regions. In fact, every region in America is richer than the South. Just look at this map of the poorest states of 2022. You'll see it generally mirrors the Bible Belt. And while this may be because of a variety of things, such as voluntary poverty, lack of education, or lack of opportunities, they are directly related. But the thing is, just like how Christianity has been on decline in the North for a long time, now it's in the entire US as a whole. And yes, that includes the Bible Belt. Christianity, the largest religion in the United States, experienced a 20th century high of 91% of the total population in 1976. This declined to 73.7% by 2016 and 64% in 2022. Ironically, the Southern Baptist churches, which, if you remember, weren't popular in the North, are declining in every region besides New England. That's right. It is literally the only region in the US where South Baptist churches.
I thought that was the most fascinating things about this video. Much I was already aware of, but I did not know that Southern Baptist church is growing in the New England area, which kind of brings the conversation back full circle. Because what we've been talking about is the English Puritans landing in Plymouth, their effect, their theology, the Reformed Calvinist theology, and how that was unique and how it had influenced their civic responsibilities, how that then gets morphed with some of the other Protestant denominations and what becomes the Episcopalian Church, Methodist, Baptist, and now we come back full circle, as I argued earlier about the Puritanism is the skeletal bones of modern day evangelical Christianity. We come back to where evangelical Southern Baptist Christianity is only growing in the New England area. What are the chances of that?
Grew. Overall, Christianity has been in decline in the US for a number of reasons, with some of them actually mirroring the same reasons that ended the Great Awakenings, such as
And this last ending, what he's getting ready to do is basically say that Christianity is eventually going to be a minority faith in the United States because of the rise of the nuns, the people who, on a religious survey, when the Pew Research Center sends out, "Are you religious?" and it says, Christian, or it says Protestant, Christian, Catholic, Muslim, Buddhist, Jewish, Hindu, these types of things. And then at the end, it'll say none of the above, which includes atheists, agnostics, and spiritual but not religious. And I think it was 2018 that none demographic was the biggest of each demographic, especially amongst younger people. So he's going to make the argument that Christianity is going to go away. And I would argue this is why I feel like he's probably left of center, because anybody who's kind of has their finger on the pulse of culture and what's going on online is Christianity is not going to go away. And in fact, more traditional forms, i.e. Orthodoxy and Catholicism, are going to grow stronger and stronger in America. And it's tied with the movement towards conservative Christian values, because people are looking for something that's non-changing. And if you got anything from the video that we just watched, is that Christianity in America is constantly changing, always revising, always reforming, always moving into new presentations, new theology, accommodating various belief systems. And so I feel like that is the kind of archetype and the tone and tenor of Protestant Christianity in America. And so where he thinks Christianity is going to go away, I think Protestantism is going to go away, but Christianity is not going to go away. That's my personal opinion, but you're about to hear his case for why he thinks nuns are going to be the majority.
A rise of rationalism and science, but also because of new factors like America becoming more multicultural and religion starting to get mixed more intensely with politics, which has disillusioned many people, especially the younger generations. An increasing number of Americans now identify as religiously unaffiliated, often referred to as nuns. And no, not those nuns. This group includes atheists, agnostics, and those who describe their religion as nothing in particular. The rise of the nuns reflects a broader trend of disengagement from organized religion. So I guess the question is, with America's Christian population set to dip below 50% by 2070, making it no longer the majority religion for the first time ever in the country's short history, is there anything they can do to stop this? It's not just a North or South problem, but a countrywide one. Or dare I say, is it even a problem at all? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a major problem. Major problem. Just want to note that RIP said, my aunt tried to tell me we were related to Jonathan Edwards. Turns out we weren't, but I do have an ancestor who lived on the East Coast around the same time with the same name. That's funny. So thanks, RIP, for letting us know a little bit about your family lore and what your aunt's been telling everybody. Hey, shout out to Wicked Wally. I see Wicked Wally in the chat. God bless you, brother. Hope you and the family are doing well. Let me just check to see if we had any super chats come in. Guys, if you appreciate the time and research it takes to do some of these streams, please support with a super chat, comment, question. Use Streamlabs or Dono Chat, or if you prefer to use YouTube, feel free to use YouTube. And if you're feeling generous, please give some COTEL Crew memberships. Would always appreciate that. And Justin Henley throws in $10, says, God bless you and yours. Keep the world informed. Well, thank you so much, Justin Henley. Do appreciate that. Thank you very much. Okay, so the other one, now we're going to move to a totally different framework where we're going to focus on the historical context. What I was trying to lay out in the beginning, and it doesn't hit everything that I was kind of promoting because I see it, through my own lens, my own biases. But this was the best one I could find and the most engaging video. And so unless you guys really want to watch Ryan Reeves, I may just play this one of the apocalyptic movements at the end. I really don't want to play this whole thing. But this is about the First Great Awakening, which actually has real Puritan influence. And I would argue, as I said earlier, that Puritanism begins to sort of die off after the American Revolution. Like it's in constant decline from that point forward. And so Jonathan Edwards and the First Great Awakening really is the last attempt to really revive Puritanism, which it does briefly. Austin DeTulio just gifted 5 COTEL Crew memberships. Thank you so much, Austin. God bless you, brother. Really appreciate that. Oh, Wicked Wally got a membership. He says, "Woo! Prizes for showing up." W. Austin. God bless you, Wicked Wally, and thank you so much, Austin, for the support, man. God bless you. Really appreciate everything you do for me. So if you guys want to get more into these details, I mean, much of my monologue, which I didn't plan on, hits on much of all the different main points, but I may just share those links if you guys want to dive in privately later for it. PJ asked, do you prefer monarchy over democracy? Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I make the argument that really orthodoxy is a pre-modern worldview. And from an Orthodox perspective, you know, the famous quote that heaven is a monarchy and hell is a democracy. I am pretty much black-pilled on democracy. So I do not have faith that democracies are viable systems for long-term nation states. In fact, there is no historical example of that. Even in the instance of like democratic Athens, it didn't last that long. And so I believe that with the democracy, essentially you're led by an entrenched bureaucratic structure that you can't vote out. And as we already know, that the right-left political spectrum in America, it's all rigged. It's the same lobbyists, same donors on both sides. And despite you having the choice between two people, you really don't have a choice. And there's no way to make the government accountable. If we lived in a monarchy, the whole town could rise up and we can go to where the king's at or the emperor, and we can try to overthrow, wherever the crown is. At least we know who's in power. We know who has the final decision on government policies and enforcement of very laws and regulations. In a democracy, it's faceless. It's abstract. And I believe it's actually, anti-liberatory. Like maybe in the Puritan example where you have an incredibly homogenous, both ethnically, racially, and religiously homogenous, maybe you could have something like that. But still, I believe monarchy is the superior any type of governmental structure. So I'm black-pilled on basically all of the modernist options. So what do you have? Democracy, socialism, fascism, communism, and then variations of the four. That is kind of the modern period. I mean, the question of modernity is how do we govern our nation states in absence of monarchy, in absence of explicit religious identity? And so, as I said, monarchy ends with World War I. And so after that, it's like the entire Western narrative, including the post-World War II consensus, is about trying to restructure the values of democracy, its importance, and how it's tied with the identity of the West, and look at the state of the West. So, I'm pretty black-pilled on democracy myself. Does that mean I don't vote for my local elections? No, I do vote for my sheriff and in my local elections, because I've said before, I think that's important. Am I black-pilled on presidential elections or federal elections? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I am suspicious of anybody who gets elected on the federal level. Not that everybody's bad, but I'm just suspicious of everyone because the whole system is rigged. And I don't see there's any way to change the government or the American system without it eventually collapsing. Does that mean I think that America is going to be monarchical? No, I don't. I do not. And so I think Orthodox Christians or pre-modern Christians need to be kind of pragmatic about the way that, we live. And in a sense, we are of that old world mentality. So our rulers are a sort of judgment against us. It's an indictment against the nation. And in that sense, America pretty much is led by the people who deserve to lead it based on the values of the populace and what we've condoned to happen. Because Americans, despite some of the positive attributes, have just been incredibly lazy. And the whole 20th century, I would argue, is a slow deterioration of whatever project America was supposed to be. So that's kind of my take on that. Thank you very much, PJ, for the $2 super chat. Do appreciate that. Okay. Now this last video is very much Moldy Apple. What was that? If you have a panel on playing with nuts all day, invite RIP. Yep. Okay, will do. Yeah, exactly. Rebel Umbrian says, like I said, we have the leaders. Unfortunately, that is true. I mean, from our Orthodox elders, New York City and LA are Sodom and Gomorrah. And, as much as I would defend my family or my, American compatriots, lesser or greater extent, I mean, America is Babylon. I mean, look at what we export to the world. Doesn't mean there aren't good values. Doesn't mean there aren't great people. Doesn't mean there aren't inspiring points of our history that we can look at. But yeah, generally speaking, we as a nation have really, really dropped the ball. You can point to the boomers. You can point to the presuppositions of the American project, which is kind of what we're laying out here today. So anyways, let's check out our last video here. And guys, if you'd like to support my work, please do so with a super chat. Would greatly appreciate it. And this is a video that's going to give you a historical context for our conversation today and everything that I was laying out. So check it out.
Austerity and spiritual purity. The Puritans were all this and more. One might go as far as to call them religious zealots. Zealot here is not a derogatory term, but a grounded depiction of their way of life. The Puritans believed very strongly in their religious sensibilities and were willing to do just about anything to see them be carried out. As was often the case with new religious movements, the title of Puritan came from the opponents of this religious movement, who ridiculed them as being unrealistic purists. Those labeled with this title took up the challenge, declaring that they were indeed Puritans, just as their adversaries had claimed. The Puritans were successors of the Protestant Reformation that shook the Catholic Church to its core. The Reformation was sparked when a Catholic monk named Martin Luther began questioning the official teachings and narratives of the Church. On October 31st, 1517, he nailed his 95 theses to the doors of an abbey called All Saints Church, also known as Castle Church. Luther ignited a dialogue that led to a new movement among Christians, and soon, new denominations began to spring up. Before the Reformation, the Catholic Church, whose very name Catholic is the Latin derivative of a Greek word meaning universal, had positioned itself as the universal church in the land. After the Reformation, several denominations in Europe competed to gain faithful converts. Martin Luther became a primary leader of the Reformation, but he was not the only one. Close on the heels of Martin Luther's rise to prominence was a man named John Calvin. John Calvin is crucial to the history of the Puritans, as it was upon his subsequent doctrine of Calvinism that many Puritan beliefs and thoughts would be based. John Calvin was a French reformer who, after fleeing his native France, set up shop in Switzerland, where he preached his beliefs on predestination. Like Luther before him, Calvin stressed the need for faith for Christians to achieve salvation. And also, like Luther, he believed that salvation was not something someone could earn through good works. Rather, it was something one could only achieve through faith in God. He preached that man is truly humble who neither claims any personal merit in the sight of God, nor proudly despises his brethren, or aims at being thought superior to them, but reckons it enough that he is one of the members of Christ, and desires nothing more than that the head alone should be exalted. He believed that whether we come to faith in God or go astray and turn our backs on grace and faith, all of it had been predetermined in advance. This viewpoint would become an important fixture in the life of the Puritans. In medieval Europe, religion and politics often went hand in hand. Persecution of minorities, whether ethnic or religious, was quite common. In the beginning, the Puritans were religious reformers who sought to separate English Protestants from the last vestiges of Roman Catholic tradition. In neighboring regions like Switzerland and Germany, the Protestants enjoyed considerable religious freedom, making their brethren in England quite envious. While England entered the Reformation shortly after Martin Luther nailed his theses to the church door, it took time for Protestantism to take hold. The English Reformation's initial cause was also much different. It began due to a falling out between King Henry VIII and the Pope, which led the English king to separate from the mother church and declare himself the head of a brand new church, the Church of England. Even though he was theologically opposed to Protestant thought, the excommunicated Henry wanted the annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon to stand. In many ways, the Church of England was Catholic in all but name. Many of the Catholic Church's doctrines and rituals carried over to the Church of England. Perhaps the biggest difference was that the Pope in Rome no longer had any authority over the English. King Henry VIII's declaration as head of the new Church of England opened up the floodgates, and a religious reformation began to take hold in England. The Puritans were against the Catholic Church and sought to purify the Catholic teachings. The founders of Puritanism did not intend to start a new religious movement. They simply wanted to cleanse the Protestant Church of England of underlying vestiges of the Catholic Church. One of these early reformers was Thomas Cranmer, an Archbishop of the Church of England. With the progress of these reformers, the Puritans would become even more puritanical, soon rejecting just about all other Protestant faiths that differed from their teachings. Protestant gains were overruled in the era of Mary I, who was also remembered as Bloody Mary. Before long, it was a crime to engage in any religious practice outside of Catholicism. Queen Mary I angered England's Protestants even further when she married the Catholic stalwart Philip, the King of Spain, in 1554. Close on the heels of this marriage was the announcement that Catholicism in England would be officially restored. Then, in 1555, Mary went a step further by putting Catholic laws regarding heresy back in place. This renewed push against heresy would cost Protestant reformers such as Cranmer their lives. This persecution forced many Protestants to flee to Switzerland. After the death of Mary in 1558, a dichotomy emerged among the following British monarchs. They realized that the best way to deal with the religious disparity was to walk the fine line between Catholicism and Protestantism, without leaning much towards either. The Puritan Protestants wished to eliminate this tradition since it seemed to harken back to Catholicism. Considering the Protestant reforms in some other parts of Europe, the Puritans were ashamed of the slow pace of the Reformation within the Church of England. This sentiment was summed up in the anonymous tract Admonition to the Parliament, authored in 1572. The tract proclaimed its disdain, stating, "We in England are so far off from having a church rightly reformed, according to the prescript of God's word, that as yet we are not come to the outward face of the same." Queen Elizabeth I was a middle-of-the-road reformer regarding domestic affairs, and a stickler for keeping the status quo. However, while she sought to maintain the slow pace of reforms at home, she was quite progressive when it came to her Protestant policies abroad. Queen Elizabeth became a kind of Protestant crusader when it came to taking on Catholic Spain. She was a staunch supporter of the Protestant-leaning Netherlands, which King Philip of Spain was actively trying to bring back into the Catholic fold. The political and religious dispute between Britain and Spain escalated to war when Spain tried to invade England in 1588, but was repelled by the British Navy. Many Protestants and Puritans alike viewed this success as a sign of divine providence at work. After Elizabeth's passing in 1603, more Puritans became hopeful regarding her successor, James Stuart, a champion of the Protestant sect known as the Presbyterians. Before being crowned in England, he was the King of Scotland, where the Presbyterians hailed from. Also known as James VI, he became King James I after the union of England and Scotland in 1603, and proved to be uninterested in most of the suggestions put forth by the Puritans. He did agree on one important point. There should be a new English translation of the Bible. The King James Bible was welcomed with open arms by the Puritans, who had been calling for an English version of the Bible for all to be able to freely read for many years. The Puritans, however, did not have the favor of the king when it came to their battle against priestly vestments. Many puritanical Protestants ended up getting booted out of the church simply for declining to wear them. The Puritans in the Church of England began separating and creating their own religious movement. King James was a Calvinist, but a Reformed Calvinist movement called Arminianism started to find its footing in England. To tackle the so-called Arminianism controversy emerging in Protestant circles, the great minds of Calvinism came together in the Netherlands in 1618. King James I sent his representatives to the conference to argue for the complete rejection of Arminianism. Such efforts pleased the Puritans. These positive developments were enough to keep the more vocal voices of the Puritans down, and many were content just to engage in what they called practical divinity. But soon after, in 1619, some Puritans felt it expedient to circumvent the will of their king when he decided against backing his son-in-law, Frederick, the new king of Bohemia, in his struggle against Catholic forces during the 30 Years' War. However, besides some clandestine efforts such as these, most Puritans were willing to tolerate King James as long as he in turn tolerated the main tenets of Calvinism. In 1622, King James issued a command to safeguard the public from religious confusion. Only those who held a Bachelor of Divinity or higher would be permitted to teach predestination, further upsetting the Puritans. Many Puritans sensed further trouble ahead when King James allowed his son Charles to wed a French Catholic princess. And when Charles I came to the throne in 1625 and began practicing Catholicism openly, they felt that their worst fears had been confirmed. The arrival of King Charles led many Puritans to seek a new place to plant their faith, the Americas. The Pilgrims and others came to America on the Mayflower, making their home in Plymouth in 1620. But many are unaware of just how much religious piety drove these settlers to leave their old world for a completely new one. It was not in search of gold or land that the Pilgrims, who were separatists, although they shared many things in common with other Puritans, embarked on this dangerous voyage. They wanted religious freedom and a chance to build a society according to their ideals. Today, Plymouth is a city in Massachusetts, but initially it was a part of the general colony of New England before separating off into the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Pilgrims, who settled in Plymouth, were led by William Bradford, among others. Before even stepping foot on land, the Pilgrims famously signed the Mayflower Compact, in which they dictated how the colony should be run and how their individual lives should be lived. This document would prove pivotal in shaping America. The philosopher John Locke, whose famed social contract later influenced the very creation of the Declaration of Independence, cited it. To say that the words of the Mayflower Compact were influential would be an understatement. Upon landing, the Pilgrims began building up their settlements and practicing their principles. Not long after, the non-separating Puritans sailed to the Americas. However, the non-conforming Puritans did not break away from the church like the Pilgrims did. Rather, they sought to fix it from within. Further waves of Puritan migration were in the works, and by 1630, a Puritan leader named John Winthrop was leading the so-called Great Migration of a large Puritan flock to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Church of England was far too oppressive and retroactive for English Protestants, who wished to reform how their religious services were carried out. Even though the English had broken with the Catholic Church, in many ways, it seemed that England was Protestant in name only. With all the trappings of the Catholic Church intact, it was foolish to pretend otherwise. Only when the situation was no longer tolerable in England did the Puritans begin to look toward the Americas as a permanent refuge for their flock. To learn more about why the Puritans left England, check out our book, The Puritans, a captivating guide to the English.
So that video gives you a good, again, that's basically much of what I presented in the opening monologue, but just for your own edification and comprehensive analysis for Jason's stream today, I thought we could certainly include that. And I'm going to share, we're not going to dive into Ryan Reeves. Those are long videos. They are worthy of consideration, though, and you should check them out. That one right there is on the First Great Awakening, and then this one is on the Second Great Awakening. So check those out if you are interested in the topic. Pablo Winscobar throws in a couple bucks, says, tell Tony this is every last penny in my bank. Thank you. I don't know who Tony is, Pablo. You have to let me know who Tony is, and I'll make sure to relay the word. Hello, listener throws in 5, says, democracy is a way for the J to make us think it's our fault things are going wrong. You picked the wrong guy, Goy. It's your fault. Pick the wrong guy. Is that a reference to something I said? Did I pick somebody? Oh, hello, listener is Tony. Okay. Well, this is Tony. Hey, Tony. God bless you, brother. Thank you very much for the $5. So, I mean, obviously, does democracy allow subversive forces to manipulate the country and the governmental institution more easily? Absolutely. So, I mean, Jays weren't behind democracy itself. That's very much the European Enlightenment. But your point, I get your point. I don't disagree with subversive elements in the donor class and the manipulation of democracy. Yeah. I'm picking up what you're putting down, Tony. So we do appreciate it, my brother. God bless you. Let me just double check. Mark throws in $10 over on Dono Chat. He says, thanks, Patrick. Well, thank you, Mark. Really appreciate that. God bless you. And let me just check Streamlabs. Tony says, Enlightenment was seeded from Masonic halls, which were funded by... Not exactly. I mean, I've done a lot of research into the history of Freemasonry, and really it was were Jays involved? Yes, but a lot of non-Jays as well. I mean, Masonry really is founded by the Knights Templar when they flee after the Inquisition up to Scotland and found the Scottish Rite Freemasonry. And it was influenced, if you want to talk about Jays, I mean, it was certainly influenced by esoteric spirituality. So, Christian Kabbalah, which really got going after Giovanni Pico della Mirandola during the Renaissance. And that mixed with, again, the Rosicrucianism, the Hermeticism, the Gnosticism during that period. And when the Royal Society is founded, which is what we consider the founding of modern science, that's 1660 in London. And in that same century is when we start to get the speculative masonry, right? So speculative masonry is what we're talking about, where they have these weird rituals, 33 degrees, all this different stuff, Alfred Pike and all that different stuff. So it was really a way, Masonry was a way for many of these people who are part of these elite scientific communities to essentially maintain their esoteric, Kabbalistic, distorted form of Christianity and in relationship with these ancient mysteries. Because Freemasonry, speculative Masonry, is tied with the belief that these ancient mysteries are efficacious. You have to make your devotion to the grand architect, the general monotheistic God. So is Masonry more consistent with rabbinic Judaism? Absolutely. Absolutely. If you're talking about, again, the monotheism or the theological understanding of God within rabbinic Talmudic Judaism and Masonry, yeah, there's a lot of overlap there. But I it's definitely not true to say Jay's funded or founded Freemasonry. It totally comes out of heretical Gnostics and heretical Christians that were incorporating Gnosticism, esotericism, Kabbalah, all that different stuff into this new hodgepodge worldview. So, but I get your point, Tony. I get what you're putting down there. It was funded by London banks. Am I wrong on this? Yeah, but those London banks during that time, that's well before the Rothschilds get there, from Germany. So London banks were not Rothschild controlled by the time Freemasonry, the 17th century. The Rothschilds come a little bit later. AB says, Dr. David, just let me Jaceberg. True. At least leading to the French Revolution. Yeah, absolutely. Are Jays part of a revolutionary spirit? Yeah, I think E. Michael Jones has a book on that. If you're interested in looking into the Jewish revolutionary spirit, did it influence, again, much of the social reforms after the Enlightenment? Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, after the French Revolution, that entire 1800s, that 19th century, socialism, and you really can't avoid, that's when you start getting into the influence of various Jays and the Bolsheviks and Lenin, Lenin being a Mason, Marx being a Mason. And it's because they both had this weird utopian anti-God understanding, or at least anti-Christian, I should say, anti-Christian understanding of the way society should be shaped. Yeah, the French Revolution, we're talking early 19th century there. And then, what is it, like 1848? Isn't that the year of revolution? There's like 4 or 5 different revolutions in Europe that occur. Is it 1848? I don't know. I'd have to look it up. The 1800s, there's one of the years that I think it's 1848, had like multiple revolutions. And then because once you start moving out of the end of the 1800s or the 19th century, the Global Jewish Alliance, various Jays are certainly working behind the scenes during these, especially the socialist, communist movements, anything related to those. And many of them were Masons, for a fact. I think when I did a stream on the history of Freemasonry, we talked about how Lenin was a Mason. I can't remember if Trotsky was a Mason or not. I would suspect that he probably was. Because that's how part of they built these pamphlets, and the social fervor that they built up was in with these Masonic lodges, especially in Switzerland. Right, Switzerland was a huge hub of this. So, Tony says, I have a whole timeline on this, but it's too much to do in text. Yeah. DPH, you should definitely do a stream about France after Napoleon. That's an interesting topic. Tony said, I wasn't trying to politely wreck you, Tony. I get where you're coming from. I think we're on the same team. I just think there's a little bit more nuance regarding. God bless you, brother. I appreciate you being here. Thank you for your support, Tony. God bless you, man. No shots fired on this end, so don't take it that way at all. No shots fired here. Freemasonry and the Jays are very subversive. Yeah. Yeah, RIP. Same team. We're on the same team here. Oh, the Napoleon simp letters. That was outrageous. If you guys didn't check the stream I did with what was it, like the historic simp or something like that? Napoleon was one of the biggest simps of all time. We read his love letters with Rachel Wilson. That is hilarious. If you guys didn't check that out, do. Kean says, dude, I can feel the tension. Are DPH and Tony about the fist fight? No tension here, Keenan. I don't know what internal problems you're picking up on in your chaotic, internal monologue, but me and Tony, we're on the same team. We've established Tony and I are on the same team. There's no friendly fire here. No friendly fire. Yeah. Napoleon is the biggest simp of all time. That is a fact. I think we made the conclusive case. He was the biggest simp of all time. You guys are hilarious. Anyways, guys, one of the streams I got this week, we're going to be doing a deep dive of Christian Zionism and how various Jews influenced the development of this heretical dispensationalist Schofield Bible theology, and why it's really important to be aware of for any traditional Christian when talking about America. Because let's face it, we just talked about the Southern Baptist Convention or the Southern Baptist Church. I'm sorry. How many of them do you think are Zionist? If that's the second largest denomination in the United States, I mean, last time when we looked at it, at least I forget which article I pulled up, but it showed that evangelicals, it was about 50% or more are like devoutly Zionist. So it's a large swath of the United States, unfortunately. So I thought that's going to be one. And I got 3 other sponsored streams to dive into. And so if you guys are interested in sponsoring a stream, please do so with this link right here. I'd be happy to message you and we could dive into whatever topic it is you'd like me to do a stream on. But let me know. Feel free to sponsor a stream. Like I said, I got 3 more, at least 1 more I'm going to do this week. And then I have a Christian Zionism stream that President Sundowner says Josephine was an OnlyFans. She was Josephine. She knew how to control Napoleon. It was pretty pathetic. Tony says Sneed Evangelicals. You guys are hilarious. Jason says, I think Prince Harry is the biggest simp. Could be. I mean, he was also on our list. I think he was voted second. We did a poll during that stream. I think we did 4 different historical simps, and Napoleon won by a large shot, but Prince Harry was in second. So it's not wrong to pick Prince Harry for sure. But President Sundowner, thank you so much, brother, for the $20 super chat. You're totally right. Josephine, she was not only sleeping with she was literally sleeping with every man but Napoleon while he was sending her tons of love letters while he was conquering Europe. That's the most ironic thing about it, is the man was undefeatable until he stepped in Russia. He was undefeatable in military conquest, just won everything. And he was simping for an older woman who was sleeping around with every man but him. Sad. It's sad. History is full of ironies. But thank you so much, President Sundowner. Yeah, it is brutal. In fact, especially if you're Napoleon and people are now reading your love letters on live streams, that's got to be embarrassing. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for the support. Let me just double check I didn't miss anyone before we hop off. Doesn't look like it. And all right, guys, I just want to thank everybody so much for the support. God bless you all. And like I said, I'll be back later this week. Potentially tomorrow. I may do an open panel tomorrow. I have an open panel topic I've been wanting to do on the rise of Gnostic spirituality, or at least Gnostic ideas, because that seems to be so popular, whether it be the Billy Carsons of the world or all these sort of secret New Age teachers. It's all just repackaged Gnostic heresy. So I may do an open panel tomorrow. but we're going to be at least doing 2 more streams this week. So I'll see you guys then. So as always, until next time, God bless.